guys, and welcome to the first episode of the Bird Photography Fundamentals with Glenn Bartley
Hello.
and me, Jan Wegener.
In each episode of Bird Photography Fundamentals, we're going to be covering a critical aspect of bird photography into kind of like a deep dive to hopefully help you to take better bird photos.
Exposing your images correctly is one of the most crucial aspects of photography in general.
Nobody likes looking at dark and dreary images, and on the contrary, definitely nobody likes looking at images where critical parts of the photo are blown out and overexposed.
So nailing your exposure in the field and exposing your images correctly will not only help you to edit them easier, but will also give you better image quality and less noise in your photos, and that's something that we all want.
So one of the most important things to understand the exposure triangle. There's only three things that combine to make a good or bad exposure in a photo, and those are, of course, the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. There's nothing else. There's no magic bullets. There's no secret sauce. Those are the three things that combine to create a correct or an incorrect exposure. So our jobs as photographers is to manipulate these three variables to create the type of image that we want in the right combination to create a correct exposure and also the other characteristics that we're after. So for example, we might want lots of depth of field or not very much depth of field. We might need a really fast shutter speed to freeze action, or we might want a really long shutter speed to allow movement through the photo. But ultimately, it's only our interaction with the camera controlling those three variables that creates the correct exposure.
And to know what the correct exposure is and how bright or dark we can expose, we need to learn and understand another important part of the camera, and that's the histogram. Because the histogram is the only part on the camera that actually tells us what our exposure looks like. And it's basically the visual representation of the three variables.
A lot of people think that just by looking at the photo on the back of the LCD screen, that gives them enough information. But the truth is, you can turn the brightness way up on your screen or way down. You might be out at night or in a really dark environment, and you really can't trust that.
So when we look at the histogram, on the left-hand side, we have the blacks or the shadow areas. In the middle, we have our midtones, and then on the right, we have our highlights and the whites. All the way to the left is basically all black, and all the way to the right is like all white.
Now, there's no shape of the histogram that's ideal. It could be like a nice bell curve, it could be all squiggly, it could be all stacked up on one side and then tailing off to the end. The shape doesn't matter. It's simply a graphical representation of the proportion of the image from all the way black to all the way white. So the shape doesn't matter. But what does matter, and what's sort of ideal, is to have at least some of the histogram in that sort of that final column on the right side of the histogram. And we have a sort of a saying that we often say that goes along with that in photography, which is, Jan, help me out.
It's exposing to the right. You probably heard the term, but you're not sure what it means, or you think it's silly, because if you're actually living by that method, a lot of your images will look very bright, basically too bright. But there's a few reasons to expose so bright. One of the reasons is that it's easier to maintain detail in all areas of the image, and you will have less noise in your images, because one of the most common mistakes is that people underexpose their images a lot. They're quite dark, and then you lift your exposure slider 1 or 2 or even 3 stops when you're editing your images, and that's what really ruins your image quality. If you have to lift your exposure a lot when editing, it will introduce noise, it will make your images kind of look muddy and just not very good overall.
So that's a pretty simple thing to remember. When you're in the field, use your histogram and always look at the histogram and expose to the right. So we have some part of the histogram coming down to the right edge of the frame, but not spiking up against the side there, because that would indicate that you've blown something out. Sometimes that's okay. Let's say you're photographing up against white sky or something like that. There might be something blown out. But most of the time, you don't want anything blown out, and you want it to be as bright as possible, exposing to the right.
Another helpful indicator can also be to turn on the blinkies on the back of your camera. That will indicate on the back of the camera on the screen which areas may be overexposed. You just have to remember that the file you're actually looking at and the histogram is also showing is the embedded JPEG of the raw file that the camera is creating. So usually if there's just a few little blinkies, that's fine, because in the actual raw file that you're using, the highlights will be recoverable.
Now, of course, these days we have mirrorless cameras where we can see a rendition of the brightness and darkness of the image right in our viewfinder, and we can also, on many cameras, enable the histogram right in our viewfinder. So great tools to help us, but ultimately still looking at that histogram when you hit play on the image is the most accurate piece of information, and you should definitely be checking that.
What's really great about having electronic viewfinders is that it stops you from really bad exposure mishaps, because you will instantly see if it's way too dark because your viewfinder will be black, or way too bright because you can't see anything, your viewfinder is too bright. The only time you have to be careful is, for instance, if you're shooting in really low light, then your viewfinder will actually be brighter, it will be enhancing the image. So you think it's nice and bright, but if you're not checking the histogram, you might be underexposing by a lot.
We've talked about what you're trying to do with the histogram and with controlling the exposure, but how are you going to do that? There's a few ways. There's different ways you can interact with the camera in order to control those critical three settings that we've talked about, the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now, most bird photographers that I know, and I don't know about you, Jan, are probably 95% of people are either going to be shooting in aperture priority mode or manual mode. What do you think?
I totally agree. That's the most common ones. And generally, I'd say people always start out with AV mode because they're scared of full manual mode. But I'd say there's advantages to using both, but one of the two definitely seems the best for bird photography. A lot of people also ask me what metering mode I'm using. If you're using manual mode, it doesn't matter. Metering doesn't matter in the manual mode because you're changing all three variables by yourself: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So metering is irrelevant because I'm just changing all the variables. Whereas in some other modes like AV, the metering can give you at least like an indication for the exposure compensation. But I think the most common one would be the evaluative metering because it just measures the average of the whole scene.
Definitely. I always use evaluative metering. Now, what's important to understand is there's no right or wrong. We all think differently. We've all learned differently. It's just important to pick, I would say, pick one that makes more sense to you and kind of really try to master that. So I tend to mostly rely on aperture priority mode. So what does that mean? In aperture priority mode, I lock in the aperture that I want to use, I lock in the ISO that I want to use, and then I let the shutter speed float to create the correct exposure, the exposure that the camera thinks is correct. Now, the camera's not always right though. Sometimes you have, for example, let's say a really white bird on a very dark background. The overall scene is very dark, and that would result in the bird being totally overexposed if I just shot at the metered reading. So in those cases, I simply dial in some negative exposure compensation to compensate for the much brighter bird and create the correct exposure. That's how we do things in aperture priority.
Don't you find it confusing that oftentimes when you have a very bright scene, like a snowy owl on a white snow, most people would think you'd have to have negative exposure compensation then, but usually it's the opposite. If you have a very bright scene, you usually have to go 1 or 2 stops brighter to actually find the good exposure.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jan. What's important to understand is, I guess, two things here. One, you have to understand that the camera's meter is always trying to create the average. It's always trying to create essentially neutral gray. On that histogram we talked about, it wants to try to get everything to average out to the middle. So if you point your camera at a very predominantly bright snowy scene, it's going to make that white snow look like gray snow, which that's not what we want. We want the white snow to look white. So we have to tell the camera that actually we want it brighter and add compensation.
So in a very odd way, you actually have to often underexpose in a dark scene and overexpose by a lot in a bright scene. I think that's something that's a little bit difficult to wrap your head around at the start, but once you understand what the camera is doing, then you're ready to go.
What I like to think about is what's the anomaly in the scene. So I know the camera wants to create everything to be average, and I know that if something is either way darker than average or way brighter than average, it needs my attention. So for example, if we have a bird that's really bright on a kind of dark background, it's much brighter than the average. And then I have to think, okay, if it's much brighter than the average, the camera is going to overexpose it. So I need to dial in negative compensation. And the opposite would also be true. So that's how, if you're shooting aperture priority, maybe you can train your brain to look for the anomaly, recognize that the camera is always trying to create an averaged exposure, and then use exposure compensation from there. Now, what about manual mode? Now, Jan, I know you shoot manual most of the time. Why don't you describe your thought process when you're shooting in manual mode?
Yes, I really enjoy having full control over everything that the camera does, and sometimes it drives me crazy when I'm in AV mode, for instance, or in auto ISO, and then the camera does the opposite of what I want it to do, or I want to do a certain thing and it doesn't do exactly what I wanted to do, or you're shooting a series of images and some images are brighter, some images are darker. Like that can happen in these more, let's say, automatic modes. It's not fully automatic, but it can definitely happen that you have a few exposures that are well exposed and then some that are too dark or too bright. So I just enjoy having full control, and I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of ease of use by just dialing in shutter speed, aperture, and ISO myself, which gives me the full control over the exposure. If you're doing that, it's very important to keep an eye on exposure constantly, because in your case with AV, you can turn your camera from a dark scene to a bright scene and you will likely still get an okay image because the camera will change its shutter speed. If I'm on a hundredth of a second in a dark area and I turn it to a sunny spot, I will blow out the image completely. So when you're shooting manual mode, exposure needs to be the number one thing on your mind. You constantly need to monitor the histogram to make sure that you're not clipping anything. And you have to think about, when you're moving your camera from a dark scene to a bright scene or onto something else, what do I have to do to my exposure. Now this is where the EVF helps a lot, because now I can get an at least estimation of how bright or how dark I am.
If you're someone like me who tends to like to shoot aperture priority mode, there will definitely be times when you will want to switch and shoot in full manual mode. So for example, typically when you're doing flight photography, you really don't want to be shooting in aperture priority. So for example, imagine you're photographing a bird, it's flying along against some dark trees, then it goes up a little against the sky, then it goes back down, then it drops down against the water. If you're shooting in aperture priority mode, the scene is, again, it's constantly trying to average the scene. So if it's a white seagull that's flying against a dark background, the gull is going to be too bright, so you'd have to have negative exposure compensation. Then all of a sudden it flies up against the bright blue sky. Now all of a sudden the bird is way darker than the sky, so you'd have to actually dial in positive exposure compensation for the bird. Look, you're trying to track a fast flying bird. There's no way that you can be changing your settings that fast. But you know what's not changing? The light on the bird. So whether the bird is against the dark background, the bright background, neutral background, the bird is in the same light when it's flying. So this is a situation where you're definitely going to want to shoot manual, expose properly for the bird, and let the background do whatever it's going to do.
Another mode worth mentioning would be manual with auto ISO, which I would kind of describe as a mix of aperture priority and manual. Because you're using manual mode, so you're setting the shutter speed and you're setting your aperture, but you're letting the camera decide the ISO. So you'll have the same kind of issues that you have when you're using AV mode, that you're not in full control of the camera and you might have images that are too bright or too dark. You can point from a bright scene to dark scene, and because the camera can change the ISO, you'll have a little bit more scope in terms of not overexposing or underexposing. You basically also then have to use some sort of exposure compensation to get the camera into the right direction, which in the end I find almost more difficult to use than full manual. But it's definitely a good way to get a great exposure without having to do all the work yourself like you have to do when it comes to full manual mode. Manual with auto ISO works pretty well in situations where you want to maintain a certain shutter speed. For instance, it's kind of dark and you want to have at least, let's say, 200th of a second, and you don't mind if your ISO goes higher. If you're shooting AV and you're setting your ISO and your aperture, you might get into situations where the camera suddenly chooses a very slow shutter speed and you get a lot of blurry images. If you're shooting manual with auto ISO, this won't really happen because you can fix your shutter speed, set it to a certain amount, and then have the camera control the ISO, which might go really high, but it will stop you from accidentally shooting at too low shutter speed. So I think in scenarios like this, manual with auto ISO can actually be superior to AV because it stops you from getting blurry images. So one of the things you might ask yourself now is, how can I do test shots of birds that might be flying past or only sit on my perch for 2 seconds? I think that's a very good point, because you actually have to set your exposure long before the bird arrives. And if you're waiting in a blind, for instance, you might have to check your exposure every 2 minutes to make sure that when the bird actually lands, you have the correct exposure. And what I usually like to do is I meter something that has a similar color to the bird. Quite often that can be a tree trunk, because there might be a light tree trunk, a dark tree trunk. You will find something that has a similar color to the bird. So if I know I will be photographing a bright yellow bird, I will focus on something that is pretty bright, take a test shot, set my exposure correctly so it's nice and bright to the right without clipping anything. And then I know when the bird lands, because it's also bright, similar to what I metered, I will have the correct exposure. Is that similar to how you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. When I'm photographing, let's say if I know it's going to be a bright white duck, a bufflehead or something, I'm looking around in the same light that I'm shooting in for maybe a white rock or somebody's white house in the background or something, and I'm taking test shots to make sure that those are not blowing out, but that I am still exposing to the right. Another thing that people used to do, or maybe still do, you can meter off of certain things. Like they always say green grass is basically a neutral exposure. Have you ever wondered why the inside of your camera backpack or your camera bag is a neutral gray color? It's so you can meter off of it. So there's certain things you can do to take test shots, but ultimately taking those test shots, making sure you're not blowing out the highlights in advance of the action is really critical if you're shooting in full manual mode, for sure.
One thing I find actually quite helpful, and that goes back to kind of thinking about the scene you want to create or positioning yourself in the field, and that is that if you have a background that has a similar-ish color to the bird, or generally having a lighter background, helps you a lot with exposure in the field. Because first of all, light backgrounds don't show as much noise, and the camera isn't fooled as easily if you have a light background. And thirdly, you can use much higher shutter speeds when you have light backgrounds. So what I do, if I have the choice of standing over here with a dark green background, or standing higher up shooting a bit further down with like a light green background or a light brown background, I would choose the light brown background, because it will actually be a lot easier to take that image, because you can have a higher shutter speed with less noise, and it's much easier to expose a scene where the bird and the background kind of have the same level of brightness.
But let's summarize some of the critical things we've talked about today. First of all, there's no one right way to do this. You can shoot aperture priority, you can shoot manual. Heck, if you want to shoot shutter speed priority, if that works for you, go for it. The critical thing is that you know how to control your camera to create a proper exposure.
So the key takeaway is here that exposure is no weird mystery thing. It's simply the combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that you dial in yourself on your camera that creates the exposure for you. So understand your histogram, expose to the right, and you're on your way to perfectly exposed images.
We hope you've enjoyed this first episode of Bird Photography Fundamentals, and that some of these tips will help you to more consistently create proper exposures in the field.
So make sure to give us a thumbs up for the video, that helps us with the algorithm, and let us know your thoughts about exposure in the comments. And also make sure to subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next video with the Bird Photography Fundamentals very soon. Bye guys!
See you next time, everybody.